Hey everybody! Today I wanted to go over a couple of different stitches and also some stitch combinations that I like to use to add a little bit more interesting texture into your work. These are all stitches that are beginner friendly, so even if you don't have much embroidery experience, they're perfect to incorporate into your work. I go over how to do the stitches, but not super in depth. So if you have any questions or concerns about certain stitches, I do have a video that I'll link below that shows some of the basic stitches that I use in this video down below if you have any sort of confusion about anything. So I'm going to be using a satin stitch, but I'm going to be stitching the stitches in varying directions, and that will add a lot of interest and texture into your piece. So basically, if you're not familiar with a satin stitch, you're just going to come up through the fabric and go back down, and you're basically laying stitches side by side one another. So I'm going to do this for a couple of times, and then we will switch it up. Okay, so now I'm going to go the other direction. And to keep this neat, I'm going to try and keep the same width for these stitches, but I'm going to be stitching them horizontally instead of vertical. And I'm not doing the greatest job of making these very neat, but I'm going to try and keep the edges very clean if I can, and go right up against that previous group of stitches we made. And I'm just going to stitch this all the way down to the very bottom of where the other stitches are. I think this would look really neat with like flooring. I did a house portrait about a month ago, and there was brick in the front area of the house on the porch, and I ended up using this combination of stitches for the brick, and I think it turned out really nice. I think it looked really good, and I didn't have to use any extra color to make it look like bricks. That's like the fun part about this, is that you can make this look really interesting without adding in any sort of color, like extra color to it. You can just use one color and it still looks very cool. So now I'm going to be doing the same thing again. I'm going to repeat vertical stitches on this side here. Okay, so I'm going to add one more stitch here just to make it a little bit more even, and then I will go down to the next row. So for this next row, I'm going to be doing the same thing, except they're going to be the opposite pattern, so that way they're staggered. So this underneath this right here, I'm going to be doing the horizontal stitches and alternating like I did the first row, so they'll just be the opposite. So I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of this box just for the example, and just because of repetition at this point, I'll just meet you back here in a moment when I fill in this entire box and you can see how it looks. Okay, so I have filled in that square and this is what it looks like. I don't know if you can tell on the screen in this video, but just the shadowing of the thread makes it look like it's almost a different color, which I think is very cool. So you can definitely differentiate between all of these stitches, and it makes for a really cool pattern. So I really like doing this, and I think it's super simple and easy to do, so definitely try this out. Okay, so for this next stitch, I'm going to be using a stitch called a brick stitch, which is essentially just back stitches, but they'll be staggered to where the seams do not line up if you do a row of back stitches together. So in order to do a back stitch, you're just going to come up through the fabric, and you're going to come back down a little bit after you come up, skip a little bit of space and come back up through the fabric, come back down where that first stitch was made, and then you're just going to repeat the process. So you're essentially just making stitches backwards. So after this first row, I think it will look better if I do one more row of back stitches and basically space them the exact same way. So I'm not going to stagger these. I'm just going to go back underneath this row, and I'm going to go exactly where I went for those that top line. Try to get them as close as you can and as uniform as you can. It'll make the pattern pop a little bit more. And now that I've done that, I'm going to stagger the next 2 rows of stitches. So I'm going to make a stitch right in the middle of where that first row of back stitches was. And that way I've started my row and they're going to be staggered now. So I'm going to make another stitch right in the middle of where that other row was and go and make a back stitch. And I'm going to go all the way down like that, making sure that they're pretty much exactly opposite of where I was stitching before. And then I'm going to make one more line of that. I went ahead and zoomed in the camera a little bit so you can see a little bit better, because this color is kind of dark and these stitches are kind of small. So I went ahead and put it at a different angle so you can see a little bit better. So then the next row, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to make my stitches like the first row. So I'm going to stagger the rows 1 and 3. They're going to be the same. And then 2 and 4 will be the same. And you just repeat the process all the way through whatever area you want to fill in. So here is the brick stitch all done. You can also do more than 2 rows of the same back stitch, or you can just do 1 and make it super subtle. But as you can see, it literally kind of turns out like a brick. My stitches aren't super neat, so I apologize. And also the thread was a little bit too dark, so I'll use a lighter color for some of the other stitches. But I really like this too. I actually used that as well in the house portrait for the brick of the house. So those are 2 ways that you can add texture, or if you're stitching something like a house portrait or something of like brick material, these 2 stitches are perfect for that. So the next stitch that I wanted to show you how you can really add some extra texture is by using French knots and varying the sizes of the French knots you use. So when you do a French knot, I'm going to start from the very center here. You're gonna come up through the fabric, and I have a whole video on how to do French knots that's a little bit more in depth, but basically you hold the tail with your other hand underneath the fabric, take the thread with your non-dominant hand, and you're gonna twist the thread around the needle, and then you're gonna go back down through the fabric. I'm just gonna twist it once to make a really small knot. So you can vary the sizing depending on how many twists you do. So for the center here, I'm just going to make 1 twist French knots. And then after I do a couple in the center, I'm going to start twisting it a little bit more and making larger knots around the center. So now I'm going to start doing 3. And now I've done a ring of 3 twist French knots, and now I'm going to do some with 5 around one last time. These might be a little bit harder to do just because it's more twists. Okay, so I finished the last ring of the 5 wrapped French knots, and this is what it turned out to be. It's super subtle, but as you can see, the inner French knots are very small, and then it gradually gets larger. I think doing this to fill in an area like the center of a flower petal looks really nice. And in a second, I wanted to show you how you can also kind of finish off the center of a flower to add a bunch of extra texture as well. So the way that I like to finish off the center of flowers sometimes is to do a chain stitch around the French knots that you made. And this is just an example of how playing with stitch direction and a combination of stitches can really add a lot of interest to a piece. So I'm not doing anything special. I'm just going to make a chain stitch all the way around the center of this flower, which I should have probably picked a more realistic color for the French knots, but just for example's sake, I'm going to use a contrasting color, and I'm just making some chain stitches around the French knots. All right, so I finished the ring of chain stitches, and I think it looks really cute. Doesn't look realistic, like I said, but I think it would look really nice for the center of a flower. So the next stitch I really like doing, I'm going to be doing a basket weave, and this is super simple to do. I would recommend for you to have not just your embroidery needle, but maybe a tapestry needle. Tapestry needle is basically just a needle that has a blunt tip on it. That way you're not snagging the thread, because you're going to be weaving in and out of the stitches you make. So with your regular sharp embroidery needle, you're going to basically make some straight stitches in whatever area you want to fill. And I'm going to make 2 stitches side by side one another. You don't have to do it this way. It depends on how thick you want the weave to be, but I like the basket weave to be a little bit thicker. So I'm making 2 straight stitches, and then I'm going to skip some space, and I'm going to make some more straight stitches. And you're just going to continue this down all the way across whatever shape you're making. All right, so I have my vertical stitches, and now I'm going to go back in with the horizontal stitches. So I'm going to start from the top, and I'm just going to come from right outside of the last group of stitches I made. I'm going to go down just slightly below where the edge of that stitch is, because I'm going to be weaving in and out underneath some of these stitches. So I'm going to go over this group and weave under this group. And then I'm going to go over this group, weave under this group. And I forgot to switch out my needle, and it's snagging on the fabric. So after this one, I'm going to switch out. And then you're just going to end by going over. And if you need to, you can kind of push the thread up, make sure it's at the flush with the very edge of the stitches. And then I'm going to come back up right underneath where I ended that and do it again and group these together. So it'll be over, under, over, under, over. I'm going to switch out my needle really quick. Okay, so I'm going to go under. I'm right-handed, so this is a little bit tricky. And then you're just going to come back down through the fabric. If you need to, you can kind of push those stitches up. And then you're going to come back from the same side underneath that group and come up through the fabric, and you're going to do the complete opposite now. So this will be under the first group, and then over the next group, under the next group, over the next one, and under the next one. And then you're just going to go down through the fabric. And you're going to do the exact same thing again and group them together. So I'm going to come up through the fabric. I like to come up first before I go underneath so I can kind of see where my thread is going. So you'll go under, over, under, over, under, and then back down. And you're just going to repeat the process all the way down, alternating like that. All right, so that stitch is all completed. You could even add a couple of satin stitches on the top to make a little handle, to make a little basket. I think it's really cute. And yeah, it's pretty simple. So the next stitch that I wanted to go over was a turkey stitch. And in this stitch, it basically looks like a rug, like rug tufting. I didn't learn this stitch until a couple of years ago, and I think it's so fun to do, and I don't think it's that hard, so I'm going to share it with you today. All right, so you're gonna actually be coming from the front of the fabric up for this one. So you're gonna start down, I'm gonna start at the left side, and you're going to pull it down and leave a little tail at the end here. You're gonna go back up to the left of where you came up, or came down through the fabric, and then you're gonna go back down right beside where that first stitch was that you made. Then you're going to come back up right where that first initial stitch was. And this is basically anchoring in place this first piece. See how it's not moving at all? So now you're going to end up making little loops as you go along. So you're going to go back down through the fabric, and you're going to leave the loop and don't pull it all the way through. Then you're going to come back up to the left of that loop, just like you did the initial stitch, and then back down the right of that stitch. Pull tight, and come back up where that center stitch was. And you're just going to repeat this entire row that way. And this stitch, you have to end each row. So if you're working with a single strand of thread, you're going to have to snip that row and start fresh. So I'm going to work my way down so you can see a couple of these as I go. And then I've reached the end of my thread, so I'm just gonna pull it through, and then that row is done. So I'm just gonna leave all these loops for now. It doesn't really matter the size of the loops because you're gonna end up trimming the pile later. But in the meantime, I would not recommend trimming it each row because it's just gonna get in your way. So leave the loops and then continue on and start on the next row. All right, so I'm starting on the next row. You can leave a slight amount of space. It really depends on how dense you want this to be, but you don't have to be like right up against that first row. It will kind of fill itself in when you trim the pile. So honestly, I probably went closer than I needed to, but. So you're just gonna work the next row and you're just gonna continue on, filling in as much of a space as you want with the stitch. And I'll meet you back in just a second. All right, so now you have a bunch of stitches that look crazy. This is my favorite part though. So basically what you can do is you're gonna trim all of this and to the desired length you want. So you can either cut the loops first, or if you're gonna be trimming it super short, you don't really need to. But I like to kind of cut the loops. And then you can trim to the desired height you'd like it to be. It's like giving it a little haircut. All right. Also, I forgot to mention, but this stitch looks best with 6-strand cotton if you use all 6 strands because it will kind of separate and make it look fuzzy like this. So yeah, this one is like one of my favorite stitches to use with things. Like you can use it for flowers or grass even, or whatever you really want to make something look a little bit more 3-dimensional. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you have any ideas of how you would incorporate some of these stitches into your work, please leave them in the comments below, and also let me know if you'd like to see any more videos like these. I'm also going to link 2 embroidery patterns and also insert a picture here so you can see them. I have 2 patterns available in my shop that are really affordable, and they use a couple of basic stitches to add more texture into your work. I think they're really fun to do, and it's a way that you can apply some of the stuff that you've learned here to your work. So I'll leave those below. But yeah, let me know what you think, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you.